Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Automators. Today is like the culmination or the end of a super long journey because we finally have Dan with us today because I think I reached out to you the first time in maybe 2019 and you were like, who the hell is this guy? So it's great to have you here. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, thank you. It's great to be here, and I hope that the pot of gold at the end of our rainbow has been worth the trek.
Oh yeah, for sure. This is the second time I think we were gonna have the show taped, but the first time you were like in the middle of flying somewhere, right? You were like in an airport stuck somewhere.
Yeah, I got stuck in Switzerland when we were going to record a few weeks ago, and it was just a nightmare. So yeah, appreciate rescheduling.
Oh yeah, no problem. So you're kind of like one of our heroes. I know that I haven't reached out and told you that, but I get this occasionally. I get an itch that I just got to scratch, and for me, everyone keeps talking about Cloudflare Workers, and I just haven't built anything yet. And so I was digging into the documentation recently, and it just feels like something that's crazy exciting. And I know we're going to get to that in a couple of minutes, but can you just give everybody a quick intro, tell everybody about your bio and your background, a little bit about Salt?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Dan Taylor. I'm currently head of research and development at Salt. We're UK-based or UK headquartered technical SEO agency. We predominantly specialize in the technical and demand gen side of things. We work a lot with a lot of tech and SaaS companies, ranging from the likes of Cloudflare, GitLab, Proton as well. And we also work in a lot of high e-com. And yeah, Salt was kind of founded 8 years ago. I've been there 6 years as one of the early people who kind of joined. And the premise behind the agency was to be different to other agencies at the time and be more of a problem solving. And seeing actually going, listen to the brief, listen to problems and scope around it versus having a set of frameworks or packages or token models and things like that and try to square peg round hole SEO as just a channel and start branching out into product and engineering and other stuff early on.
Wow, that's super cool. So give us more insight into the types of problems that you enjoy solving. Like, what are some of the craziest ones that you've gotten to dig into?
I think the word enjoy is very objective in that there because that's a very, masochistic way of saying about work. But I mean, at the moment, I'm working with a publisher who has about 750 million URLs that we know about. So there's a monitoring element there, and every now and again they just lose 20 million URLs, gain 15 million, lose 20 million out of the index.
Wow.
So putting in place monitors around that in the best ways we can, because obviously your Search Console's got one of the weakest APIs in terms of volume known to man for this kind of data set, to make sure that the URLs we're losing are 10-year-old articles that no one cares about when I don't care about the lost, and we're actually getting good crawl rates on the new stuff. So we're surfacing in Google News, on my publisher apps, etc. So that's one of the fun ones at the moment. I think another really interesting one, which probably ties in with SEO kind of moving forward in Google's angle, is working with a few e-commerce clients at the moment. Every 2-3 months, correlating with some of the unconfirmed updates we're seeing, Google seems to be doing kind of like a cache clear out where for a couple of, one of the clients I work with is a complete JS front end. They haven't got a pre-rendering solution in place. That is one of the things we're working on at the moment. So when Google does this cache clear out, it's taking probably 225 of their 250,000 SKUs and just canonicalizing them to one of a random product and dropping them from the index. And then it slowly re-indexes them again. And this kind of correlation thing, we're seeing different correlations across different sites coinciding with the unconfirmed updates. It very much feels like at the moment, Google's really pushing for that resource refinement, because there's going to be a point with Google which is going to be like a critical mass where it can only store so much information, it can only parse so much information, it just becomes cost inefficient, unstable. So, and we've seen this with John Mueller in recent times coming out saying things like 20% of the site not being indexed is normal. We've seen numbers of websites just reducing the total number of keywords they rank for. So anything like 80 plus has just been exiled from the databases. So ranking position 80 plus from databases, etc. So it does feel like at the moment Google's getting more strict with its resource allocations and towards value propositions. So making sure that both technically and member content value proposition sides are the best they can be aligning to this is probably something we need to start thinking about more. And that probably then pertains to things we can do with workers, both from a fix and a growth point, and just general things we can start thinking about from an SEO perspective as well.
That's super interesting because it brings to mind a conversation. No, I'm not sure if it was an Agency Automators episode or a Clubhouse where Arnaut was talking about how Google's pushing more and more towards reducing its load on rendering like pages, rendering content, which, you know, he theorizes one of the reasons towards the big push with Core Web Vitals is to help reduce that server load on Google's side with rendering. That's super interesting stuff.
Yeah, the Core Web Vitals element makes a modicum of sense from it because we've already got benchmarks in terms of speed. We had benchmarks in terms, if we go back 10 years, we had benchmarks around links, keyword inclusion, structure. As SEOs, we abused all of that. We lost those toys. So Google's had to come up and develop new benchmarks, and Core Web Vitals data is something it can collect to a decent sample size, given Chrome's penetration as a browser globally. It's relatively easy to collect that data anyway, which it kind of does, and then to reciprocate that as part of the algorithm to then decide what it does and doesn't spend resource on makes complete sense, because I think sometimes it's easy to forget that Google is a private organization and a company, and all what it does comes at a cost. And we kind of focus on the byproduct, which makes users go to it, whereas what they make money from is obviously about top of fold ads and other ad elements.
Mm-hmm. So when Google is doing this refreshing of their cache, how are you flagging it? Is it through spikes in log files, like in crawl rates, or are there other signals that you're looking at?
So we're not seeing any kind of, this is the other interesting thing as well. We're not really seeing spikes in crawl rates. We're not seeing any kind of changes in what abnormalities in Google's behavior around it. We're literally just going in what we're seeing in Search Console, and the number of valid pages literally just goes down like a cliff edge overnight. And it's almost like Google's just done that push, and bang, it will slowly reindex. That correlated with a unconfirmed update in October, and then we had November, December, January, 3 months happened again, and then we had February, March happen again. And if we look back at the data across other clients around that same time, correlates to the unconfirmed updates. Other clients we're seeing at that same time in the third-party tools lost a lot of the 50 plus keywords, and they started to see a reduction in total keyword visibility, but not that many changes around traffic driving positions. And at those same points as well, we've also seen a heavily localization approach to a lot of phrases in the US. So some clients I worked with previously had like a marquee, what I call the marquee keywords, that big head term, which is neither local intent or general intent, but because over time Google's picked up our data, it's tried to localize that SERP a little bit more. So that's almost like it's potentially trying to go from a holistic view on some keywords, narrowing them down and then spreading them out across its shards versus one larger database. That again goes to the, if you're in Kansas, this is a local query for something in Texas, we can remove you from the database and it can trim its data down even more.
Arnaut was talking, it seems like we rely on Arnaut for a lot of this stuff. It's crazy, but he was telling us about the correlation between changes in the knowledge graph and unconfirmed updates too, where you'll see, like, he'll see his knowledge graph change when there's an unconfirmed update, and then it takes a while for Google to kind of like re-index all of that data. And so he'll see his knowledge graph shrink and then get more and more properties over time. I think that's accurate. That's pretty interesting. Okay, so you kind of like blew my mind a little bit, and I had a set of questions that I wanted to go down next. I want to know a little bit about your analysis and your testing toolkit. Like everybody does, you know, different tech SEOs, they work differently, and they're looking at different on-site factors. Like, what are you focused the most on? Take us through like your toolkit. How much of it is bespoke? How much of it is off the shelf?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of guess it's problem dependent. Because I mean, as you'll know, working in the field, like you'll have a toolkit, and not everything requires the hammer. Sometimes you need a screwdriver or a more delicate approach. Being honest, I do have a hammer, which I do like taking out a lot with sites, but that's mainly the core crawl elements, because I think still using tools like Screaming Frog, Sidebull, and actually just getting good crawls of a site using different user agents is extremely underrated, because it's just seen as a checkbox versus actually looking at things. We were doing scoping for a large financial client in the US, and we actually just thought, yeah, we'll crawl it in desktop, and then we'll just crawl it in mobile, and we'll just see what happens. And we pretty much within half an hour noticed that the mobile user agent was being returned internal links to staging websites, and the desktop user agent wasn't. And it was like, no, like just by looking through crawls and crawl comparisons, I think the go-to too often with SEO is to go, especially in the technical field, is to look at what can be more sold, and that's going towards the core web vitals, going into more of the JavaScript stuff which is a little bit more flashy, one of a better word, versus the core basics. I think with the core basics, there's definitely things to be won on it. So I mean, inside the stacks, I run Scream Frog and Sidebull. At the moment, I've got access to another crawler as well, which a friend in the UK has developed, and he's given me beta access, but it looks good, and it looks like it could be something pretty cool in the toolkit. I'll drop him a note to tag you guys when he's ready to open up testing a bit more.
Cool.
Then just the standard kind of stuff, so Href, SEMrush, Mangles, use them all for different elements. Being honest, I've never used the technical audit tool in any of those tools, because I've just never clicked on it. Being honest, I couldn't tell you what's in it. It might be amazing. I've just never clicked on it. We also run a lot of our own kind of static stuff, so a lot of scrapers and crawlers. So with the meta description changes Google does and title tag changes, we built a crawler that mimics them all. We use rotate the proxy to the IP of the location in the US or wherever we want to say mimic, list the keywords, it'll pull the SERP, it'll pull the meta description being displayed for the client domain, and then the meta description declared in the HTML as well for that page. And it's a very quick red light, green light, this is what Google's changing stuff to. That's massive. I mean, it doesn't necessarily impact rankings, but changing the meta description meant we can try to alter click-through rate, which more clicks make client happy, which is never a bad motto with. And then similarly, just JavaScript testing tools and other things. We just generally bolt frameworks together and different APIs and stuff and go about way about things. But there's a good plethora of tools we've tested over years, but then just found we can probably just do things in our own way a little bit easier and get to granular details a lot quicker.
So it sounds like you have a pretty deep toolbox. What are some underused ways of aggregating data from these multiple tools together into something insightful?
Ooh. So again, depends on the data point, but I mean, for a lot of the low-end data basic stuff, just putting into Google Sheets and being very familiar with lots of different formulas and elements to collate is extremely useful. If we're pulling APIs into something, we'll probably pull into BigQuery and populate into Sheets or into Google Cloud Functions, or just pull it into anything. I mean, we're constantly looking at different data elements. I mean, we've tested we've been through like the whole Snowflake elements, especially with GA4 being the new looming presence coming next year.
Yeah.
We're running Matomo, Piwik, Snowflake, running different data sets. I've got some clients who, because of privacy, don't run any analytics at all. So we're using logs into Tableau and then using asset definitions there based on user agent. So it's kind of horses for courses, probably, in terms of putting it together. But for that, I'm probably going to say for 85, 90% of data and the SEO needs to use Google Sheets to a point is probably going to accomplish most of the tasks with competent formula knowledge.
No, I see you smiling. What's on your mind?
So Google Sheets and billions of pages equals lots of data, which I'm thinking is going into BigQuery right away. So I was like, Sheets. I thought it was cool.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, but I mean, how many sites? I mean, in terms of sites with 750 million pages, and even some of them with just over like 500 million, things like that, they come across once every few ships, 90% of them. And that, I mean, it's also task level, because not every task requires complete crawls of sites. Like,
yeah,
have I crawled through 750 million pages? No. Have I created lots of crawl lists based on different logs, different data sources and different elements, and then done match testing based on how their URL structure forms by products and by publication to do crawl lists that way, and micro crawls on the ones that drive revenue? Yes, so they're the kind of chunks which can then go into BigQuery or Google Sheets. But yeah, I mean, I think if I try to crawl through 750 million URLs now, I think I kind of want to, I'd be more curious to find out what value would be able to give versus the cost of crawling it, storing it, parsing it, and then looking at it.
Yeah, it's just a massive, massive problem. So do you know Robin Allenson from Similar.ai?
I don't know.
Super cool dude. He was on our show recently, and he had a really interesting blog article. You know, when you look at Search Console data, it's heavily sampled. The percentages of what's sampled is very high. You know, when I started working with the API, I was pretty shocked. I expected it to be like 10 to 20 to 30%. And the percentages that I was seeing were between 60 and 80% sampled, depending on the site. He came out with this blog article where he said that by connecting at the subfolder level, they could get up to 89% of the data instead of that like 30 to 40%. And when he sent me his blog article on Twitter, I was like, yeah, well, that kind of makes sense, because Google is so obsessed with returning API responses really fast. Like, speed matters that much that when you connect at the subfolder level, they can do their work faster and return the API response. And I just found that to be pretty fascinating. And I was wondering if you had experimented with that and had similar results. And
yeah, no, 100%. I'd even say doing it at a subfolder level, or even at a deeper page path level, depending on your site structure, that doesn't just help with the sampling in the API, but also with sampling in the user interface as well, because they're both at different cardinality rates.
Yeah.
Probably going back 5 years ago, we started doing that as standard, working with a CDN. It got to the point where when you kind of went into the language subfolder from a domain and went into a product subfolder, it would average out to say like every day in the month received 133 clicks, for example. And it's like he's trying to average it out because he's interested in speed, but he's just making the data rubbish. So just created it out of a subfolder path, and it has the less cardinality that a data comes back. The only issue is with that, well, the other side to it as well, but it gives you back, it isn't just the the cardinality, it's also the obscure filtering you sometimes get on query level. So one thing I see a lot in the Google forums and on Slack groups and Twitter and stuff is when people will come back and say, oh, this says I've got 1,000 clicks. But then when they look at all the keywords listed in that table underneath and they do the maths, they say, oh, there's only 954. That's because Google is still returning accurate numbers. But what they're saying is, well, yeah, you did get 1,000 clicks, but there's, I can't remember what number I sent up. There's 46, for example, which the query, well, the number of clicks for it was so obscure and the query was so obscure, we don't feel that the user will have privacy if we return that query for you.
Yeah.
So that breaks it up. When you do it at a subfolder level, that isn't as much of an issue, I found. You tend to get a little bit more granular data in there again, because for me, it's created a new data set within Google and it's trying to pull it back, show you the same speed, but you get the less obscurity filtering.
Okay. So can you give us a sense of like, what's the most amount of properties you've pulled out of a website?
I can try and do a count really quickly.
Ballpark.
Oh,
Tens, hundreds?
Hundreds. I don't think it's in this account. I mean, now, oh yeah, I've got one in the account I'm in at the moment, which is 113 subdomains set up. And then some of them have got subfolder level. And then we've got another account which has just got the company's got like 30 plus websites in each country as domains in each country. And then
damn.
So that, by the way, I think so. A couple years ago, Dan Leipson was on the show, and he told us how they get an entire verticals like keyword pool, and he described like basically integrating, crawling the SERPs, and also leveraging SEMrush API at the same time. So you'd like get a SERP, get all the URLs, then hit the SEMrush API to get all of the URLs for all of those 100 pages. And then you would do the same thing to go get all of those keywords data, get all of those 100 pages, get all of those keywords. And when I heard that, that blew my mind. But I got to say, in all of the 40 episodes or whatever it is that we've done, that just blew my mind the most. And I just want to say that for our listeners. 113?
Yeah, that's all on one domain.
So how many rows of data are you getting a day from the API when you're doing that? Like 50,000 is the max per property, but are you getting just a ton?
I mean, it's fair to say as well, I'm not pulling it every day for every property because,
right.
I mean, I'm mad, but I'm not that mad.
Right.
But generally, when we do the pulls for it, no idea. Just being completely honest, top of my head, but
a lot. Yeah.
we'll sample it across it because yes, there's 113 broken up on a single URL by subdomain, or sorry, 113 subdomains on it, but not all subdomains are equal and not all subdomains are cared about as much. So we'll probably only look about 20, 25 of them. Couple other projects similar to that kind of working on this is in another account, which I'm not logged into for at the moment, but in one country, they've got 30 plus domains, separate domains, and then they're global. So again, it's I love when I see stats when someone does like a really big crawl and has like this really big data set and like, oh, the API did X 100 million, I don't know, fan doozy things or whatever. But then it's like you're gonna have to parse that and you have to find value in it. Otherwise, you just spent a lot of money to extract something, a lot of money to store something.
Yep.
And being honest, because of rate limits and everything else, by the time I've probably pulled all the data I need to from that, it's going to be so out of date because of the time taken from the first point to the second point. There's no point in doing it.
Yeah. Okay. So you're dealing with really big problems at significant scale. And you've got difficult problems. So how do you prioritize and how do you think about what matters? How do you find meaning and like, how do you think through that problem solving process? Do you have a framework?
So probably twofold. So in terms of what matters, what doesn't, I kind of feel that ties back to wider project elements around like the conversations we'll have with product, conversations we'll have for engineering. Some things we might just find out are just no goes 100% because of X, Y, Z 5 years ago, or just because of how the product roadmap is, or something like that. In terms of the actual prioritization element, we tend to have a good relationship with developers because just the approach we try to take with things, and I mean we have software developers in house as well, so we try to I don't want to say talk dev, but we try to approach it in more of a standard way that they would raise issues or epics, for example, on Jira. And then for prioritization around issues, we use Fibonacci scaling. So again, aligns with agile methodology. Do you want me to just explain what Fibonacci scaling is?
Yes, definitely, because a lot of our audience hasn't heard of it.
Yeah. Okay. So essentially, Fibonacci, anyone who did grade school maths, is a numbering sequence. So it's a similar, like some people will say priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, or I know devs like to use t-shirt sizes commonly as well. Fibonacci goes from 1 to 55 and it increments by adding itself. So it goes like 1, 3, 5, 9, and it adds the sum of parts onto it until it reaches 55. 1 is typically like a little box tick, nice to have, like your title tag is 1 character too long on the home page. That's a 1. It's a box tick. Whereas 55 is an earth-shattering, like this will make a massive difference to performance or achieving business objectives. So the way that we go through that is we would do a scaling from an SEO perspective, but based on the business impact and anecdotal experience. We'll then ask the developers to review the ticket and make a similar score based on development resource and time and effort to do it. Then the output from that typically is a wonderful score of high impact SEO, low impact development, and then time estimations. So we can almost then start to roadmap and prioritize and schedule just based around that, really.
Do you average the two scores to come up with like a sum, or is it just you have a sum for each dev and SEO?
Some like it averaged. Others we do a multiplication, but then the multiplication is weighted. So because you can have you can have a 55 SEO ticket that has a 1 development score, and that would create a 55. Yes, 55 times 1 is 55. Sounds checks off. But then by token, you can have a 1 SEO score that's a 55 dev, and that'll be the same score. So the way that's weighted is that if dev score is higher than SEO score, it's weighted in similar fashions. There's a modifier on it. I think about 1.75 we do, so that we never get that conflict. So it should always be best effort to return first, then it gets incrementally into that middle ground of effort to value. Remember, lots of effort, no value at the end.
Okay, let's talk Core Web Vitals. Let's get it out of the way. What are you seeing in the data? How much does it matter to the sites that you're working on?
For a couple, quite a bit, especially in the holiday vacation space, especially on aggregators where you want the quick results, quick find, quick prices. In most other verticals, there's been some nice correlations in resolutions, and there's been more so in impressions that we've seen the correlations in Search Console versus actual revenue or leads or things like that. But generally speaking, if Google's rewarding the impression element, then by proxy, more impressions will eventually lead to more clicks to more revenue. So it could just be that knock-on effect still coming down a waterfall. But then at the same time, whilst they've been doing this big push to increase this, to get more impressions, to increase indexability, to increase visibility, going back to our first point of the discussion, they've then just started hacking away at the total number of keyword sites are visible for anyway. So it's almost like loads of websites have now started to come above this threshold of, yeah, this is great, we've got more visibility, when Google's just lifted the bar of indexing and the indexing quality threshold higher. Are they really an SEO thing? I think, generally speaking, because it lives in Search Console, that's why it's kind of been bundled into tech SEO. I mean, obviously, if a site is slow and not performance and just horrendous, that's as much UX as it is SEO. But Webmaster Tool, or sorry, Search Console. Wow, that was an old flashback. Search Console isn't necessarily just an SEO tool. And that's why it used to be Webmaster. Now they call it Search because obviously it just pertains to Google Search as a product. I just kind of think it's just fallen under our remit because other teams necessarily didn't want to pick it up or didn't want to do it. But it's nice to make graphs go up, and in some verticals it can have an impact. But I think, like people say, it's more about tiebreaker. But I think with so many other factors that go into it now anyway,
to
have two websites in an exact same position across all other factors, where then you have core web vitals as a tiebreaker, you're never going to get that tie scenario.
Yeah. This reminds me of the time that I was building my Search Console pipeline, and you know how they return 25 rows per page? I didn't build my do while looping properly, and I got exactly 25,000 rows back, and it killed my script because I was checking like, I don't remember what I did, but I didn't handle the case that it would be exactly 25K. Okay. What is Edge SEO? Some of our audience has never heard of it.
So Edge SEO is essentially a word or name I've been credited of giving to something which some SEOs were doing 10 years ago. And the practice just became a lot more mainstream because of CDN adoption, CDN evolution. So 10 years ago, people like Hamlet, rest in peace, were doing things by hard coding on server edges, and that's all right, and doing payments around doing performance through middleware. Other SEOs were doing hard code on the edge as well, but then through, apologies, I've just been annoyed by my cat as well. Essentially, the practice of implementing change. I wish mine was a still. Come away from the camera. It's basically the practice of implementing a form of change through the CDN layer versus the CMS layer. Cloudflare kind of went relatively first with it through Cloudflare Workers, but Akamai have Edge Workers now. Edgely have a fast solution. You can do things through Lambda at Edge on AWS, so it's relatively accessible now and relatively mainstream. That's working.
So when I started jumping into the docs, Cloudflare Worker docs, I had a couple of takeaways. Number one, I felt like I was seeing some pretty killer documentation. I don't know if you felt that way too, but their Hello World apps seemed really cool. I guess I want to know, when you're building them, it looked like a really simple Node app, like just super, super simple. Like, how much work can you actually get done and still return the response inside the time limits that they enforce? Like, I want to know how much stuff can I do inside of a worker?
So, being completely honest, how they've developed, you can pretty much, especially with things like Cloudflare pages now, using as an example, you can probably just build full websites and HTML return stacks within workers. In terms of latency, when we were doing testing originally on that, the latency was like less than 20 milliseconds. It was extremely fast. Obviously, the bigger things, if you do API calls as part of a worker or other elements, it adds the latency time of return from there. But outside of that, it's become a lot more robust as a solution. We obviously Cloudflare Workers.
Ooh, if you wanted to, do you want to, so like what I've seen is, I forget what the name of the service is where you rewrite HTML. It's like HTML rewrite or rewriter, something like that. It's like a class or something like that, or a method. I saw that you can like rewrite page elements, right? And I thought, oh, that's really cool. I could do that. I could rewrite page titles, meta descriptions. I could rewrite headings. Like, what does that actually look like when you're doing it? Are you testing a whole bunch of stuff? Like, are you doing 15 different changes on page, or are you just changing one element? Like, when am I gonna, how much stuff can I do and not worry about that time limit, I guess? I know I asked the same question twice. I didn't mean to, but.
No, it makes sense. I think really, so our main use of it really is less about the on-page elements and more infra-level stuff. So, I mean, the first use we used from back in 2017 was we migrated a complete domain from Git pages to headless WordPress. And at the time, Git pages didn't support redirects. So we put the entire migration redirect file onto Cloudflare Workers, and even 5 years on, it handles it. And every time I say that, people pull a face like what John says, and it's like, oh, how did it go? And it's like, normal. They treat you like a redirect. There was no, unfortunately, there was no bells and whistles. It just happened. But in terms of how it actually looks, I mean, the latency depends, because the way the workers work essentially is you have the clients we use or the browser or Google, and it makes that request to the origin. Obviously, most requests go through Cloudflare or the CDM, and then we just basically use filters, and that's the main premise of how it works. So you'll have a request chain filter, which could be pseudo A/B testing, redirect.
Yes, keep going. Go.
Yeah,
Sorry.
And kind of before the page element is returned, that initial filter, then you can do optional response filters. So this is where like apps like Logflare, Cloudflare Logging, Cloudflare Analytics. You can also use workers to move logs into like Logjam or other log readers as well, if you don't have access to direct server logs. So it's not a server log, it's just a pseudo log. And then you have a third chain, which is a body filter chain, and that's where you can inject hreflang, dynamic meta titles, different things. So with a holiday company, we used to pull the lowest price back displayed on the page, like vacations to New York, and then dynamically inject that into the title tag. So when Google rendered the title tag and rendered it on the SERPs, it always pulled through the cheapest price. So that really helped. Then you've got your background requests, everything else, and then your response. And it just really depends what you're trying to do. If it's title tag changes, body element changes, H1 changes, it's relatively minimal. If you're wanting to do anything dynamic on the fly, and you're relying on API calls, different systems handling it, but it's just about latency element added onto it. But generally speaking, I'd probably say 95%, if not more, use cases are barely noticeable in terms of our latency.
I thought that the worker had to finish its work within a certain time frame or it would fail. Is that accurate?
You can set it up to do that. So we use it as well for cache pre-rendering, which is a fun little trick. So lots of JavaScript websites, you can render on the fly to Google at every single request, but through workers, you can also upload a sitemap, store that in Google Cloud Functions, use Rendertron or something like that, or Prerender.io to pre-render all the URLs on that sitemap, store it in a database, and then when the worker detects Googlebot coming, you return the rendered cache, the pre-rendered cache version, and you just update the pre-render on a daily basis. So that goes from being every Google request that day being pre-rendered to one request per URL per day being pre-rendered. And for some sites, that can reduce cost, reduce latency. And then if the page doesn't exist, for example, in the sitemap, or it's not run the cron yet for that day, it can acknowledge that. It'll have a timeout limit set on it, and then it'll just return the page as normal. rather than 500 responding.
So I'm hearing massive impact on quantity of content that gets crawled and indexed when you're doing that.
It's a very useful way of doing things at scale. The way I always look at workers as well, though, is that my preference is to always try and do it on a native stack first, then to do it on the edge, because when you're starting to do things through the middleware, you probably won't have the same modifications happening on staging in dev environments. And then when you do deployments, that's where bugs can be introduced, etc. And that's kind of why with Sloth, I know you mentioned earlier, we put certain protocols in place to try and prevent that from happening, because there's no point in having a really awesome tool that causes damage every time you use it.
So do you find that the workers you're deploying are primarily used as a stopgap until either in-house devs have the time and resources to deploy it server side?
Yeah, I mean, the main way, the way we approach it, I mean, I know some tools and some softwares use it as a new way of implementing stuff with less dev resource, but ultimately, if a site is, for example, hemorrhaging revenue because hreflang issues, and we need to quickly deploy hreflang across all the sites. We had this a couple of years ago with a company, travel company with 16 different CCTLDs. All of them were different CMSs, all of them different country teams. The only thing they had in common was they all ran through the centralized Cloudflare and the system there. So none of them had hreflang. You had all countries misranking different areas, bad user experiences, bad conversions. Write a code, hit deploy, and then globally you've resolved an issue until development can put that stopgap in place, and that can make the difference. Sometimes that can run forever, but it's just adding another dependency onto a piece of infrastructure which you may look to replace in the future, so it's having a backup. Other times, like with Git pages, it was the only way, so it's just doing it in that sense. But other small things, like I said, with the dynamic pricing title tags, it makes sense because it's an opportunity which isn't adding additional cost to infrastructure, which can increase sales. So most uses from a technical perspective are stopgaps, Hail Marys, or even to prove a business case. Because if a business says, oh, it will require $100,000 worth of dev resource, deploy code, deploy a little bit of change, you can do a bit of A/B testing through workers as well, prove a business case, and then you can almost de-risk projects moving forward as well.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Okay. What are you really jacked about learning next?
I know now I have to realise after doing that as my instant reaction, jacked probably won't be how I come across, but I'm actually really starting to...
Or stoked.
Stoked. That's probably a better way. I kind of feel just how we're moving towards better crawling solutions and better data elements. And I think just the improvements being made to native Google tools, especially with what we're seeing in the Search Console, additions to APIs, and even in the past 2 weeks since the GA4 announcement was rolled out, they've added landing pages now to GA as GA4 as a measure you can use, which the mind boggles wasn't the dimension which you could use previously. So I kind of feel that as we kind of hit into the new year, just how we process and use data, because Google Analytics, whilst it is good, it's comfortable, it's nice, it's got a lot of redundancy in it. Because the numbers are in there, I think it also trains people the wrong way. So I speak to a lot of people in business who aren't necessarily SEOs, but because they look in analytics, they see red arrows, they see green arrows, they see graphs, they start talking to me about bounce rate, they start talking to me about average time on the site. And I mean, a good case example I had about was we had an article ranking a page in Hub and Spoke kind of learning center with a client that was ranking amazingly for all its target keywords. And they decided at the top of that page, they were going to do a little 2-minute video, which beautifully executed, lots of investment in the animation, which kind of explained the entire page. So someone coming to that page could look at diagrams, look at the text, or read the text, or watch a video. Absolutely great user experience. I'm going to let you hazard a guess as to what putting a 2-minute long video did on a page which had about a 5-minute average page duration. That knocked it down to about 3 minutes. And the time, I mean, like literally in Google annotations, it was just a clear, you put a 2-minute video on it, people are watching the video and leaving. The amount of panic that caused, but there was no change in rankings, no changes in traffic, no changes in leads, no changes in return visits. Just people are now going, I'm not reading 1,000 words, I'm now watching a nicely animated video. But again, it's trained people, in my opinion, to look at the wrong things. So I know GA4 requires a hell of a lot of setup out of the box. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
It does seem like it's democratizing data. It's making it so that professionals have to be involved.
There is that element, but that is definitely an element of it. I also think there's an element to it as well where it's helping businesses also understand that if it doesn't exist there, it's not something to worry about. And I know a lot of the Google and GA4 like literature pushes it towards being more about user experience because it is more kind of user-focused metrics. But it's interesting that it's still looking at user metrics, but like bounce rates in there, which for me, I'm so happy he's going, but because I'm bored of having that discussion every month with people. But the de-democratization of data, I think, isn't always necessarily a bad thing anyway, because if you look at especially enterprise level like Salesforce doing connections with Tableau, and you've got all the BI insights tools and things like that, moving towards that, and I kind of would then question the SMEs who necessarily look at analytics, look at traffic, and look at other things in different ways. Is it as important that they invest time and resource into those numbers and into that data side versus the data they'll have from naturally running a business and knowing like product lead, product sales? So if you look at Shopify's internal analytics, for example, that's extremely lean, it's extremely limited, but you can very quickly go in there as a business owner and go, right, which products have sold well, see seasonal trends, see SKU trends, and get those quick answers without everything else.
So what do you struggle with in terms of insights? What's hard for you in your day-to-day job? What do you wish you had better visibility into?
I think one of the hardest things I personally come across more than anything is just because of the kind of people who we work with. And this isn't a slight on them, I need to caveat here, but they really adhere to GDPR and the cookie consent elements. So the amount of dark traffic which we get from organic and other channels, for example, and that can be a pain at times. I've worked with sites where we worked out and estimated that probably 1 in 5, 1 in 4 users aren't accepting the cookie drop. Wow. So that's working that out to a level, and we've seen analytics accounts tank when they've deployed a cookie mechanism, which fully adheres to illegal, like we all should. But then outside of that, just in general, one thing I would love Google to be able to do better, but they're moving away from cookies, which is going to make this harder, is the attribution element, because how businesses run and how businesses work, because they're omni-channel, they're offline, they're online, does not align with how most data and how Google likes us to report on things. Businesses report on a multi-touch point, or they report on, if I put $50,000 into PPC, I need a 7 times return back on revenue. They work in that metric, but because multi-attribution and multi-touch point isn't as prolific in data tools, isn't going to be as prolific with cookies, it makes it harder with that business discussion necessarily, and also understanding the multi-touch point, because I can look in funnel analysis in GA now and I can see that someone came organically, then 17 days later, they never came back again, but then there's a direct email thing that came through and someone's converted, and that's because someone, for example, in a company will have researched a tool, researched a solution, probably done a trial, vetted it, gone, oh, this is great. Then they'll have emailed the pricing page to somebody in the business with a credit card. Then they'll have made the contribution. So you look at all the work organic's done, all the work social's done, all the other content, the free trial, all they see then in analytics is a non-redeemed, non-upgraded free trial. But email's doing great because that's just getting really quick returns. And it's that attribution point which we need to find a better solution of mapping, in my opinion.
I try and advise my clients to focus on the bottom line. Are we experiencing revenue growth as a business? And to get them away from thinking about single channel. And I feel like that sounds stupid, especially when there's multiple agencies involved, all providing value, but it almost feels like a fool's errand to try and solve the attribution problem because it's just getting harder and harder.
And I think to that point as well, like you said, other agencies are involved. That PPC agency or that paid social ad agency, they're going to have a contract, they're going to have KPIs heavily related to ROI, and they're going to want to measure for ROI elements. I have the same conversation. We start coming in and saying, oh, but we should just focus the number as a whole. The salesperson from a PPC agency just then starts looking at you like, shut up. No. And it's not the conversation, but I mean, most businesses get it. Most businesses understand. And the approach I take is SEO isn't a marketing channel. It's a visibility and acquisition element where it has to work with product, has to work with engineering, has to work with paid, social, PR. It has to understand all those elements to best return user value proposition content based on what people are searching. PPC can do it because they can pay for it. Target a nicely laid out sales page at a very commercial intent keyword. We've almost got to do the brand education, the product education, and everything else around it to get users to that one.
So it's more low level, not low level, but foundational elements like, does the website work? Will it return the page in an appropriate amount of time for someone to convert?
Yeah, I'd also say it's helping steer clients away from the old method of like, here's an article talking about the solution, then right at the end of it, here's a nice big paragraph, which is just a sales message kind of thing. It's also helping the right messaging at the right time on the right page be right served to the right use by the right query. And this is where, for me, the old, I know we're running tight on time, but personas, for me, started to fall down a few years ago with that because they'll map content types to a persona. And going back to the thing that, yeah, persona might work, but that persona ain't going to convert. That persona is going to forward the pricing plan to procurement or to a manager or someone else. And what you've got to do is make that journey for that person who's going to forward that email as seamless and as quick as possible.
Wow, Dan, this has been amazing. I love it. I'm so glad we finally got to meet.
No, me too. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah. I knew it was going to be awesome. I just had to get the time right. Jordan, I love this one. This was super cool. So Dan, you blew my mind. You totally blew my mind with the quantity of properties in Search Console. I'm going to release that as a highlight just to get people jacked about it or stoked about the episode. Super, super fun. I feel like I want to do another episode with you where we look at code. Do you think you'd be open to that down the road?
Yeah, I would. I was going to say it would need to be down the road because
it's fine.
This month, Pat. I'm in the US all of next month as well, so we're probably going to be looking end of June. I'm going to be in California, Texas, and New Jersey. So
cool. Sounds great. So let's see what else. I think this has been amazing. Everybody, thanks for a great episode of Agency Automators. Jordan, any last words?
Again, I've said this the last 3 episodes we've recorded, but mind blown yet again.
Yeah.
Yet again.
I felt like with the last 2 episodes, I didn't emote properly when they were saying things like 500 million URLs, and I'd be like, yeah, 500. So, but the quantity of properties, that blew my mind. Like just the amount of data that it's pulling and the amount of work and the amount of analysis that it opens up. And I just thought that was super, super cool. Okay. Everybody, thanks. Dan, you're amazing. Jordan, amazing. Everybody, Keep automating. We'll talk soon. Ciao.
Thanks, Dan.
It's